Okay, so again, welcome everyone. So we are introducing Professor Coulombe from the University of British Columbia. Antoine's career in social work started in the late 90s. He has a BSW from the University of Quebec and an MSW from the University of Quebec in Montreal. He has over 12 years of social work experience in different areas with individuals, groups, and communities in a diversity of healthcare, school, and nonprofit settings. He has worked with youth, families, adults, sexual minorities, and the homeless, as well as persons with disabilities, chronic disease, and mental illness, and from different cultural backgrounds. Early in his career as a social worker and community organizer, I think this is very important sort of to really think through the community organizing experience of our professor today and think about two things. He developed and consolidated the first resources to support LGBTQ+ youth in the Quebec City region and organized awareness programs in schools and youth services about LGBTQ+ realities in order to fight against homophobia. He also contributed to advancing LGBTQ+ rights and was a member of the committee responsible for writing the first policy against homophobia for the Quebec government. During his master's degree, he conducted research on the empowerment perspective when working with LGBTQ+ folks. He served as a full-time social work instructor at Maria Victorian College School of Social Work. For over 10 years, he taught social work theory and practice through the delivery of 7 different core elective and co-op courses. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He also collaborated on research exploring the applications of universal design for learning in teaching social work. So again, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Coulombe.
Let's see how this goes. So thanks for inviting me. I think this is for me a special moment. This is the first for anyone in my family to be a scholar or be an academic. The first time that someone in my family speaks outside the country as well in an event like this. And so I felt so excited. And I tried to, I guess, make this politically personal at the same time. I want to thank UCLA for organizing such a fabulous site and everything. And I really rejoice each time I see people taking the time to think. It's not something that we do much nowadays in our society, to take a pause and think. And let's try to stop being productive for a while and start being reflective for a while. And I think that's actually really cool. I could almost say it's a political action nowadays to do this. So thanks for joining everyone here. And also thanks for the international ISU something. Somewhere for social work. I think it's great that it exists, to create a space where we can come from our different cultural background, different experiences of social work, and have a conversation about it. And I think you'll find, well, I'm finding, anyways, in my experience, that these moments are so meaningful. I had so many conversations yesterday with so many of you, and it really got me thinking some more about my experience of social work as well, as I was meeting with your experience of social work. Yeah, let's see how much time I'll take today. I always have too many slides. I have one of my students here in the room who may have spoken to a few of you about my work, but I tend to have too much content as usual. But maybe I should ask you a question first, maybe. Just by show of hands, folks who have read or studied a little bit or a lot about Freire, just a show of hands. Okay, I give you an idea. So it's about just a little over 50. So I think today what you'll see is we'll cover the basics. So if you've read it before, please note I'm just making my own presentation. This is what Freire wants us to do, right? He wants us to integrate it in a way that feels personal. So I'm going to try to do it this way. But I did choose a lot of quotes from Freire with a hope that everyone could have a bit of a base also. And the link to the presentation will be shared this way if you prefer just listening. If you like taking notes, please go ahead. It's all as you wish, but you'll have access to the slides, which provides, I think, a good introduction to many of these concepts. I'd like to, well, as I was walking on campus today, on the traditional ancestral and ceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, well, first I was appreciating my moment. It felt in a way, it was a good moment for me. But I was reflecting a bit on history. Every time I go and visit a place, I know so little of the history there, and I'd like to know more. And I always remember that history is my teacher. You know, history is my teacher. If I take the time to study history when I visit a place, I may learn something about my own humanity. Maybe things that we didn't do right. Maybe things that we did do right. You know, and sometimes history is that missing piece I think in social work, and we should connect with it because there's so many teachings in history. So as I spend some time in the next days, I hope I get to the museums, for example, to go and learn about the local history here and maybe gain some depth of understanding. Okay, so for today, oh, thanks for switching at the same time. I forgot already.
Yeah.
It'll be kind of in, I guess, 3 parts, maybe 4, we'll see. I'll talk a bit about me, just so you know who I am, and we're at that sharing moment, like we said, we're in an international moment, so I thought it would be useful in that context as well. But I will also share about my own culture, my own background in Quebec. And when I prepared this presentation, I was thinking, why was Ferry so popular in Quebec? It was huge in Quebec, in my teachers in social work. So I wanted to go back in history a little bit and see when that connection happened, what was happening in Quebec's history, and how did it connect when Ferry's idea arrived. Because I wanted to understand why my profs were so passionate about me when I was in your shoes, for example. So I'll share a bit about this. But also today is a bit of an homage to my first grade teacher, my grandmother. So I'll tell you a story about my grandmother as well. But for me, she was my first grade teacher. And she still lives in me. I'm still listening to her advice here and there. So we'll share a bit about her, which will give you an idea a bit about Quebec recent history as well. And then we'll cover the main concept of Frere. Frere, there's going to be 2 parts to this one. And the second part will be closer to continuous learning and social work. So here's the thing. When I started preparing this idea, that was like years ago, I was thinking critical pedagogy, we always look at it in a way of how to prepare teaching, how to prepare social work practice. But how does it relate to how I learn as a social worker in action? We know that in social work, most of our learning happens in action. Everyone's experiences here will probably speak to this as well. There's so much learning when we meet a new situation, when we have a new colleague that has a new expertise, when we have a problem in our organization that we need to solve. All these day-to-day things are usually our main teachers. So really the conversation you'll have this afternoon is how does your experience of learning in action connects with critical pedagogy or the ideas of learning? Because that will be your challenge. So maybe today keep this in mind as you listen and try to start thinking of how these concepts relate to your own experiences. So you can bring some stuff to your workshop, some ideas to discuss. Does it make sense? Okay, any questions so far about our program today? So in the way I work, I really enjoy interaction during the presentation. I have another slide, so I might have a bit of. But if you do have ideas, thoughts, questions, please raise your hands and join in as much as you can. Please be brave, and I would like to say be brave and courageous and bring your ideas and questions to people. So about me, I'm white. I come from a settler background. My family came from France a long time ago. They were working class. They worked in farmlands, for example. Yeah, so that's one aspect. I'm Quebecois, so my mother tongue is French, or Quebecois, I would like to say, my province. I am also Canadian. I have this dual identity in who I am. I'm proud of my Quebec background, and it's something I'd like to share a little bit more because it's not very well known around the world, but it's something I'd like to share. I have lived in many places. Quebec City was my hometown. As a child, I lived 3 years in Colombia, in South America. As a teenager, I lived about 2 years in St. Lucia in the Caribbean. I did live also in Chicoutimi, a very small town north of Quebec City, where I did my undergrad. I lived in Montreal for the longest, probably around 10 years. And I lived in, been living in Vancouver for 6 years. I share this because these experiences have had big impacts on how I perceive prairie, how I perceive my practice of being a social worker. My experience of living in different cultures and having experienced all these things shifted many things in the way I practice social work and I experience social work. I'm queer. My pronouns are he and they. I have a long-time relationship with my boyfriend, 18 years. I came out during my undergrad. And after my undergrad, as a good social worker, I thought, well, if I need help, and I believe in social work, I'm going to find myself a social worker. So I joined support groups in Quebec City, and I realized that there weren't any services for me. So the social worker, after a few months, he asked me if I would co-facilitate the support groups. So I started shifting from youth to co-facilitator. And the year after, I was the director of the queer youth organization. So within a matter of 3 years, I did my coming out, the first full-time social worker to work with queer youth in Quebec City. And in that period, we had to think about everything. How do we practice social work? How do we negotiate with government? How do we transform cis-normativity or homophobia, biphobia from being, homophobia was the trend at that point. That was the trendiest thing, was to be homophobic. How do you turn it around to being unpopular? So we had to figure out all these things. And there weren't many books about how to practice queer populations. So we had to write ideas. And each time I got lost in those years, I went back to prairie. I went back to these basic ideas. When I lost my north or lost my sense of direction, I had to go back to the book. So that's a crucial moment in my understanding of prairie. Because I read Prairie not because I wanted to read the book, it's because I really had to find solutions. I had to find a way to move forward, and we did. And we created a movement in Quebec. And in that movement, we went in front of government and requested equality of rights, and we won. All during those years. You know, my area was queer youth, and we had a coming out movement in those years. Huge, it was massive. It was led by teenagers and young adults who were questioning society. And then I saw coming out as a political action. When I come out to my parents, I'm disrupting something. I'm disrupting the normality order in my family. And it was a really beautiful time. It was a time I'm very proud about. I still have good connections with my queer community in Quebec, and they're doing great. Great work. I'm also Buddhist. I don't talk about it very much. I just started talking about it. But I realized that books talks about her experience with Buddhism and other critical thinkers. I got interested in Buddhism because I wanted to see, I like revolution. That's not something I like to do outside, but I want to see what does it look inside. So I was looking for tools that could help me do a revolution inside in the way I did my thinking. The way I did reflect on life, you know, its meaning and things like that. And Buddhism gave me those tools for myself. There are many other ones, but that's the one I chose. Yeah. I like talking about Buddhism also because I experienced also religious discrimination. And that helped me with insight. What does it look like to experience that? That I had experienced, you know, queer discrimination, things like that. But now experiencing that was a different thing. And if you know the relationship between heteronormativity, homophobia, and religion, you can see it's very eye-opening for me to experience also the one about religion. I'm a social worker, community organizer. I started teaching 16 years ago, and more recently, I'm starting to consider myself a researcher. I'm a bit of a baby on that side. So here's a map of Canada, which is the country, for those who don't know, the north of the US. It's quite large. It's a quite large country. Quebec is that province highlighted. It's a majority Francophone province. There's a long history of, the war between the French and the English in Canada, and the English won, which created a context where the French were second class for a long time. So it's one of the 13 provinces and territories of Canada. It's the second largest in population. Ontario is the biggest population. So it's quite a large population. If you look at the bottom of the province, there's like a river, the St. Lawrence River. That's where the majority of the population lives. Most people don't want to live up north because it's quite cold in winter. And yes, we do have warm summers. Some people were wondering about that. It's not that much north. So yeah. Let's go to the next one. So this is a picture of my grandfather, and her kids. My grandmother had 9 kids. At that time, she always was very close to religion, and religion was influencing families to have large families. So it was very common to have, 7 and 15 kids at that time. At that time, they lived on a farm, and we worked for the farm of the church, which in some ways was kind of social housing or social policies of a small village back in those days. So they weren't very rich. We only have about a picture every 2 years of the family, and everyone puts their best shirt on for that picture. But you can see they were happy. They were very happy people. My grandmother was quite amazing at surviving skills, for example, and she was a strong believer in learning, education. So herself, she went on and got a technical degree that would provide her with the minimum requirement to teach in a primary school. So that's what she decided to do. I don't know how she managed. Farming, 9 kids, getting a degree. We're thinking about our lives being busy. I don't know if you heard about farming, but it's quite a lot of work. Let me see if there's anything. Let's see. Yeah. So this is actually a picture about a year before my grandparents did the hard decision of moving out of the village. Like many families were moving back to the city in the hopes of getting a better life. This is a period in Quebec known as the Great Darkness. It's the end of that Great Darkness. So I'll speak a bit more about that soon. Yeah, let's start with the Great. Yeah. The Great Darkness was a period that Quebec had a lot of conservative government who were very, very strict. And also religion was controlling most of the institutions. Schools, they were controlling health, and anything about social services and stuff was controlled by religion. But they had that feeling of being controlled by the law. It's also a period where if you're French, it's harder to get a job. It's also a period where, although the government's officials would speak French, the Anglophone rich folks were ruling the province. So really, there was no way out for poor people for a long time. This post-war, but it's that area of darkness on Earth. I think that's the next one. What then happened in the 60s, what was known as the Révolution tranquille, or the quiet revolution. People started thinking about, could it be different? Could it change? You have to be in this context, stuff like that. And they finally elected a different government, a liberal government in 1960 of Jean Lesage. And that was really a big step in Quebec in building social movements. It was probably the first big step in building equality for most poor people and things like that. It was a huge step, huge step. And the education system was one of the big steps. So at that point, government started changing so many things very, very, very rapidly. But the oppression or the control from the church and the state was so big that they really wanted to do it in a different way. So a lot of folks in Canada know that Quebec has a progressive way of seeing things. It comes from those years. It's not the last 15 years, but from those years. We can go to the next one. So it was a time of protests. It was a time of, the baby boom we call in Canada. Is it the same thing in the US, the baby boom? Yeah, other countries as well. Yeah, it was a baby boom. It was a big period of people starting revolutions, not one but many. And now that they weren't under the control of a conservative, very controlled government and the church, they were exploring many things. Yeah, let's go to the next one. Okay, let's go back to my grandmother. So it isn't exactly in that period that they moved to Quebec City from Saint Narcisse with the village. And they were lucky enough to get an apartment in social housing for their first years in Quebec City. So that's them at the table with that apartment, 2-bedroom apartment with 9 children. But they felt happy. They had the opportunity of moving forward. So what happened to my grandmother is she was able to get a position as a primary teacher. She had experience at Saint Narcisse. There were more and more kids that were increasing rapidly, so they had to hire as many as possible. But she had a brilliant idea for my grandfather. She decided he would work at the university. He wanted him to work at the university. I'll tell you why afterwards. So she knew she was involved in the church, so she knew the right people. She was a young volunteer, someone who talked to the community quite a lot. And she was able to request for my grandfather to get a position as a janitor at the university. That's the job he got. He was cleaning student residences at night. They thought it was perfect. With 9 kids at home, one parent works a day, and one parent works a night shift, right? It kind of works. But the other thing she knew is if he got in, her kids could have access to university. And that's what she had in her mind back then. So bear in mind, none of my grandparents ever went anywhere close to university. And she was able to have 5 of her children go to university as a first generation university student, 3 of which completed. It was a huge step. It was a huge step. And that's how much she believed in university. But she didn't make this alone. This happened because the Quebec province shifted from conservative, controlling values that protected the rich from their privileges to a more social view, that was more inclusive of different folks. So that was the shift in Quebec that was happening. Now, Quebec had a huge, any questions about my family? My father is there, is the first there on the left, on your right, my left. A very typical Quebec family. And their story is very typical of many families in that period. That's why I'm sharing it as well. It's a good example. So I was thinking also, it was the next one, what was happening more in the field in that time? There were a lot of people trying to break the cycle of poverty, trying to break the cycle of being dominated by the system, trying to educate people for literacy. There was a lot of organizations being built in that period. And you have a list there of a few. I work myself with the Jeunesse Ouvrière Catholique, or the Young Christian Workers, which is really interesting. They were super progressive, but also they were financed by the church. So the church is not, all black or white, or one side or the other side. There's actually a diversity of folks, and some of them are quite progressive as well. So when I was thinking about all this, just before heading into Prairie, it's in those years, right after this happened, that Prairie's books started appearing. They had all been through all of this at that point, and they had started building their organizations. And when they received the books, I'm thinking my profs of the generation that was in social work, they found a good mirror to look at what they were doing with someone who had put in the right words to explain, this is what we're doing. So that's probably why they had such a good connection with that, with Paulo Freire, right? And of course it expanded, but they were already doing revolutionary practices. They were already thinking that if I want to also need to think about politics around it. I actually need a political awakening. That's how I like to describe fairies too. It's like a political awakening. You have the spiritual one that I actually do Buddhism, or we can do other religions or things like that. But fairy teaches us a political awakening where we become more whole, we become more complete. And until I don't have this wholeness, there's a part of me that's missing in my life. That's when he talks about being alienated, alienation. Okay, any questions on the Quebec part? I hope I gave a few, few things on my culture and background. Yeah.
The revolution that was happening in Quebec, was that being mirrored in other provinces in Canada?
Not as much. Yeah. Because it was a dual revolution. It was also the church, but also it was the political one, Francophone versus Anglophones, and having been in poverty for so long, I still hear my uncle speak about why do you need to speak English to get a job when you're the majority in the province? It's still in their thinking. Yeah.
That kind of trend for software education, it comes from France and from
Sorry?
the trend for software education, it comes from
It came from everywhere, I think. It came from many places. The trend for popular education, is that your question? Where it came from? I can't pinpoint because it probably came from different places. Quebec culture really goes and meets with other cultures. So I remember Prof talking about going to South America and learning about collective kitchens, for example. The connection with France also. There's always been a strong connection with France and Quebec. And France is so political that we must have learned a lot of stuff from France as well. And we have that in us in Quebec as well. We're very political. It's a minimum per year that I would see one full day of student strike. It's a minimum. The maximum was about 2 months long. We did a 2 month strike once. So students are political in Quebec, and we teach them to be political because we don't want to go back to la grande noirceur, the great darkness. And as the story tells us, even in the US recently, if we're not careful, history repeats itself. We have to continuously be vigilant. I know it sounds a little bit hard sometimes, but if we don't take care of politics takes care of us. And it's just a reality. And we don't want to because we're so busy already, right? And we have so many expenses, and there's so many Netflix shows to watch and stuff like that. And I understand it, but the honest truth is if we don't take care of politics takes care of us. It's just honest. Yeah. I mean, I don't have all the details. When I spoke with a few folks in Quebec about that, Quebec implemented some very progressive treaties back in the day. I think right now, I think that period of the 60s to 80s. I think right now BC or other provinces are more progressive. And Quebec has slowed down being progressive in the last year. But when I heard some of the most progressive treaties, for example, I would be able to speak much more. All right, for the purpose of time, I will continue. So here's a picture of Frere, his years of life. The only reason I put it there is because to show you that he was real adult in that period of the 60s and 70s, very, very active, and that's why it's connected also with the next one. So Frere speaks about having different influences, and I think that speaks to us as well when we look at what are our own influences. I like how humble he was, and he would say that his parents and teachers had an impact on him. Like I'm telling you today, my grandmother had an impact on how I think about this. Even when I write or when I do more academic work, she's still there. And I think Frere had that as well. And I think he told us these things because he wanted people to connect with their own experiences. Like something I forgot to mention, I am not an expert of Frere. I'm only an expert of my own experience of Frere's theories. And that's okay. I don't need to think I'm an expert of Frere. I need to think about what am I be an expert of? My own experience. My own experience of Frere's. He was an avid reader of history, like learning from history. Existentialism was very popular at that time. I love that. Phenomenology, humanism, Marxism, and he also has roots in Christianity. And a lot of liberatory movements from that period actually emerged from the church. So it needs to be acknowledged. Although we need also to acknowledge the contradiction. I think it's both ways. You can't just say one side. You also have to say the other side. And there are many contradictions. And he was very well known because he did a campaign that was extremely successful. His idea wasn't to write books. He wanted to help people. Right? That was his idea. And when he had that strong energy, like you all have right now, your generation, your age, that's when he did it. He had a lot of energy. Started building these groups here and there in Brazil. He started a movement to eradicate illiteracy. But also he realized that the peasants didn't understand the laws around them. And they were being dominated, I guess, by the dominant people in Brazil. So they didn't understand, for example, knowledge of ownership of land, things like that. So anyways, when he realized that people were being exploited at the same time, he mixed up the two together, right? So Ferry is really interesting because when he met with these folks, he started thinking, why are they not more interested in learning? What's blocking them from wanting to learn? And that's why he wrote books about hope and hopelessness. Because that's a concept that helps them a lot. Why did these people lose hope? When big companies are buying them out, when they're losing what they have, when they feel powerless, why would they want to learn? That's hopelessness, isn't it? But he tried to think about how do people recover from that hopelessness and things like that. So what I like about him is he was really working with people and understanding them, what worked, and why are they feeling like this, and how do we get over it? It's kind of like us in social work, right? That's what we do when we meet. Why are they in this? What is this repeating in the next generation? And how can I solve this? He used cultural circles. I like the way he recreated education. Like they don't call themselves profs. He had a name, I think it was project coordinator. I think that's what we found this year, project coordinators or something like that. So he tried to deconstruct what a classroom looked like and reconstruct something more interesting. Because he thought maybe people, if they're thinking about school, they're already feeling oppressed because they had received or they had internalized things. Let's go to the next, please. Okay, can you drink a little bit of coffee with this one? I won't read all of it, but it's hard to find a definition of critical pedagogy. I don't know if you've tried. One of the reasons is critical thinkers, they don't like things to be fixed. Right? They like being in the movement of reinvention. So it's really, really hard finding a definition of critical pedagogy, and it will probably not hold. Someone else will find one. Okay? But I found one that I think represents a bit Freire's thinking, especially in his early years, I guess. He thinks that critical pedagogy is to clarify the legitimacy of the ethical, political dream of overcoming unjust reality. Whew. There's a lot of things to unpack, just this one, right? Yeah, it's to help people understand that it's actually ethical to have this dream of overcoming unjust reality. Wow, it's fantastic, right? Yeah. And how do we do it, right? That's a very big question. But I think for him, that's really important. If we look at some other critical thinkers or pedagogues, like Giroux is one, for him, politics like this is very important as well. Maybe Bell Hooks would see it differently. She had a more love and kind approach to her critical pedagogy. But there's always that political aspect of overcoming unjust reality, So one of his big concepts, of course, is oppression. His first famous book was the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, so he had to define it. Let's pick a few words. I like the way he says it's a distortion. You know, in CBT we learn about distortion, don't we, right? The cognitive behavioral therapy. So for him, being an oppressor is a distortion, or being oppressive. It's something that's not working. We're changing reality in our mind. So it's a distortion of the vocation of becoming a more fully human. That's the way he sees it. That's very, very meaningful. And we could probably spend a few hours thinking just about these words. He also is very, very two steps in his presentation. It's maybe my main critique about Freire, but I like the two-step presentation because it's easy to understand. You can explain it to everyone and we understand it. But life is not a two-step thing. It's more complex, right? So I just want to nuance the next one. Violence is initiated by those who oppress. So any situation in which A objectively exploits B. So it's a bit simplified, but it's very harsh on oppression. And I think that's not a bad thing. I think it's time to be harsh on violence, intimidation, oppression, discrimination, and all these things. And that's okay. But we also need to have that nuance, I think, especially us as social workers. By the way, any of these concepts are transferable to social work practice and also education. Maybe that's another discussion we could have. You know, social workers, are we also educators? You know, aren't we sometimes? Both. You know, another big concept, especially for us social workers, is alienation or internal oppression. Alienation, internal oppression. And the way he describes it is having internalized the image of the oppressor. So for my queer youth, for example, it could be to have self-hate about being gay, for example, and having internalized that you know, they're not right, or maybe they have to be a masculine gay because they internalize that the feminine ones are the wrong ones, and they have to clean up what's happening inside them. This is self-hate. Self-hate. We can all look probably in our experiences or the experiences of people we've met. Well, the interesting thing he adds is that we are also, when we are oppressed or alienated, fearful of freedom. It's something we internalize. We're not able to take that step somehow, you know, because we're fearful of what would be next. You know, we internalize that as well. But what he says afterwards, freedom is acquired by conquest. It must be, or actually in those years, something I want to share. We love talking about quests. We had quest game and PC, early computers and stuff like that. So life was like a quest, you know, like an adventure, you know. Oh,
Sorry, which one are we? Are we
Internal.
internal? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and freedom is the indispensable condition for the quest of human completion. So again, in his way of speaking, you can see that he really tries to help people become whole, complete. You know, he's acknowledging if you alienated or oppressed, that there's a peace that you're not allowing yourself to be, and there's a peace that society is not allowing you to be as well. You know, we need to find a way to solve this. Next one. And then there's a great humanistic and historical task of the oppressed to liberate themselves and the oppressor as well. So this is quite an iconic sentence, I think, from Freire, quite an important one. So he believed that the oppressed were actually very, very important people. The oppressed had the responsibility of freeing themselves so they can free the oppressor. Because the oppressor himself or themselves are also not full and well. That's when I read this when I was in my BSW, I had like chills on my arms. I still have them. You know, it's quite powerful because I saw it in my practice when I met with my queer youth. Not only they attended the groups and they felt better about themselves, but right afterwards, they didn't wait a week or a day or an hour. Right afterwards, they went out there and helped. They were on TV, they were in schools, you know, and raising awareness. They were fighting government, and they were doing exactly what I had read in this book. And I thought my job had so much meaning that day when I saw that as a social worker. Because I helped someone who is now probably helping a lot of more people, you know, and we created a movement this way. Let's go to the next one. So he talks also about levels of consciousness, and his system is again very like 1, 2, 3, very simple, and it's much more complex than that. But I like his system; it still holds these things. It still holds. So Perry's system is one of conscientization or raising awareness. We don't have that word like in English, right? Conscientization. En français, c'est conscientisation. Very, very popular word in social work. That was probably overused for a while. Anyway, so there's 3 steps. The magical step, which he describes as people will blame their inequality on fate, luck. It is what it is. It seems to be out of my control. They accept that this is my fate, basically. Give it up. Give it up. Yeah, so that's the first consciousness step. And maybe we see it in people we meet. I saw it in myself. I saw it with others. But then as you engage in critical dialogue with people, and what I mean by critical dialogue is just talking about life, having a little bit of that political lens. And slowly people start to understand how the system works around them. And that's when they may enter what he called the naive phase. People may try to change themselves or assimilate to the dominant class. So maybe at that point, people understand how the system works around them enough so they can actually have what the dominant has. People can actually have access to the same work conditions, living conditions, rights as the dominant has. But very, very fun, this isn't enough. But that's sometimes what we do, right? Social work as well. But this is not enough. Because as long as there is oppression or dominance anywhere, we haven't really solved any problem. We haven't really solved any problem. So that's why he wants folks to continue all the way to critical thinking, the next step. Now, I don't judge people I work with for anything. You know, everyone has their paths. And I'm very cautious about that in my practice as a social worker. You know, that everyone has a way of embracing their critical thinking. They won't embrace it the way I embrace it. Because we're all different, right? And I have to embrace that understanding of diversity in my work as a social worker. My critical thinking, or I don't know, and sometimes we have these discussions about, do we all see the same blue? You know, is it all the same blue? But it's the same thing about critical thinking, right? We all embrace it in a very unique way. And I always like to be curious myself of each way each person I meet embraces that. In so many ways. And that's sometimes difficult for me because when I sit in this chair, I am seen as an expert. But like I said, I see each of you myself as an expert of your own experience. So I'm always curious about your experience. And I don't see myself as being an expert of all your experiences at all. Actually, that would be quite stressful for me, you know? But anyways, these were the 3 levels of consciousness. So in his work, or in our work, what he challenges us to do is, you know, to when we work with folks, you know, how can we move this forward? Maybe also us as a social worker, how can we move our own critical thinking forward? And I tell you, there's a shift of consciousness. I don't know if you've seen it when you work with people. You actually can sense it in their eyes. There's like a light happening or something. So it's really like an awakening. You know, there's a very popular word on Netflix, but I heard it's actually part of a social movement. Woke. I don't know if you've heard about this word. Yeah. I learned about it on Netflix, but that's actually a social movement. Yeah. But that's what it is. It's that consciousness rising step. And how do we keep it moving? That's really important. And I think it's probably even more our responsibility as social workers to work on our own critical thinking. We can do a lot of mistakes as social workers. So increasing our critical thinking continually is really essential. Okay, next one. So I have half an hour, right? Just for time, so you know I have about half an hour. That was the timing I was offering.
Yes.
Next one. So Furrier is famous for his critique of education. Maybe when we read it, we can think about maybe we should critique social. We should also have that. So I think that's very common in academia, right? But we should also encourage social workers to have both sides, to have a rough critique of who we are, but also build on tools on how to improve, right? So we need to analyze the problem and find solutions. That's kind of our job. That's what he did, right? So he thought there's a big problem with education. Education could go two ways, and he didn't see it as going the second way that much. The first way is to bring about conformity. So schools could be a way of bringing about conformity. And he didn't like this because he thought it was oppressive. It was a way of controlling knowledge in a way that I could also control how things happen, how things function. So he thought actually this way is oppressive, and we'll talk a bit more in the next slide about this. But the next one is it can be a practice. Being in school, being here, can also be a practice of freedom. And for those of you who studied Bell Hooks, that was also one of her big dreams as an educator, is to talk about this classroom as being a place where we practice freedom together. Next, please. And he talked about the banking concept of it, which really happens if you think about it. And maybe we embrace it without acknowledging it. Maybe it's part of the things we internalize. When we come in a classroom, we expect to have a prof in front who has the knowledge, who will fill our brains with knowledge. So being a good prof is assessing this knowledge. Being a good student is receiving this knowledge. So that's really the banking concept of education in function. And that's what Freire said was he considered very dangerous, I would say. Very, very dangerous. Because if we adhere to this, if we believe in this, then the university becomes a way of controlling masses, controlling knowledge. So what do we do, right? What do we do about this? So Freire spent a lot of time thinking about what could we do differently after this. How do we overcome this? Again, think about connections also in social work. Maybe we're not doing banking concept, but maybe we represent the state sometimes. The government. We're asking people to follow the policy. We have that idea also of top-down approach from the institution we work with. And does that really serve social work in a way that helps people the way we want to do our practice of social work? And then we're going to have to think also about how do we change that. So maybe we can find some ideas there too in these ideas. So the way he thinks we change it is by looking critically at the world in a dialogical encounter with others. So he believes education is not a top-down approach. It's actually not even an experience that's within the walls of this classroom. He thinks education should be real, within the real world, where we can look at real world problems and engage in dialogue and logic. Dialogical is a bit of a bridge between these two. Freire was very big on rigor as well. You can't just wing it all the time. You have to think about the structure. Is it logical? Is it rigorous? So we need logic as well. It's not only about chit-chatting. I love that. But it's also about having method and rigor. Encounter with others for him was super essential. So learning should happen as I encounter the experience of someone else, as I encounter the world. It shouldn't happen with only a book, for example, or only in my mind. Learning is social. It should happen through that socializing. And it's something very powerful if you think about it. If we learn this way together, through dialogue, we're actually raising our consciousness together. And those are big shifts that can happen, big moments of growth. Look at your own experiences. In which context did you have those insights, those awakening moments? And often it happened when I met with other people. There was an event, there was a problem, there was a situation. So in dialogue with others is quite essential. Maybe I saw the insight someone else had and shared with me. All these things. Gradually perceive personal and social reality as well as the contradictions in it. So again, that idea of looking at the contradictions in the world and become conscious of our own perception of reality and deal with it critically. There are so many people who are not aware in this world that we actually live in our consciousness. And once we start being more aware of that space and the impacts it has, well, again, I could go back to CBT, we also talk about it. But let's do CBT with power and politics. Maybe we could see Ferry like this. So it's about being more aware of that space, that I also live in that in my consciousness. And then once I become more aware of that space, I have a lot of power. I have superpower in how I handle my life, and the decisions I make, my perception. And that's something maybe folks will talk about a bit later in this talk about how it changed her way of perceiving things everywhere. You know, I do think it's some type of awakening again. Let's go to the next one, please. So the next step, I'll be talking more about the pedagogy of alternatives. So any questions about the last section, which was a bit the abstract theoretical one. I think we're on time. We should make it. Thank you. That was just for me to have a pause to drink. So let's go to the next one, please. So these are the key elements I would like to call about this pedagogy of freedom. And these are the things that you'll be looking in your workshop a bit more with your team and how it relates to you. So in his books, he talks a lot about, I guess it's a mental position. If you want to learn, you need a few things in your mind. Being curious, that's the first one. Well, there's no numbers actually. It's harder, but that's the first one here. Being curious, he talks about this a lot. We're so overwhelmed by so many things nowadays. We're so busy. But we still have space in our mind to be curious. We can remember our childhood when we were younger and we had that natural sense of wanting to learn stuff. But we leave some room for that. We leave some space for that. Very practical, you know. Being joyful. Every time Ferry organizes circles, you know, it wasn't to be like a formal space where everyone's quiet. So it's to be joyful, social, community, that feel. So can we put that in our learning times, being joyful? And of course, he talks about hopeful because he did work with patients who have been under a lot of oppression from many generations. And that was always a big question in his mind. How do I keep people being hopeful? And that's a question for us as social workers all the time. So many people that we have met that have lost hope. What is that hope? How does it work? And there's not one answer. Your book is the person you're meeting with. Who's the expert? The person you're meeting with, right? Maybe, I know one of my field instructors this year told me that her big question, you know, we all have a big question to start a session with, is what brings you joy today? What brings you joy today? I think that's what she's trying to do. She's trying to connect the person with what makes her comfortable. With joy today. The next one, please. Now, let's start with the second one. So, Ferry's perception of hope is linked to how one person understands finishedness and unfinishedness. You realize very quickly that if people thought that things were fixed in society, I'm born in this level of family, I will stay in this level of family. They are fixed. They don't change. Oh, we've tried social movements, but it didn't work, you know. Then people start positioning themselves as things are finished. Or that, you probably heard that, positivism, I think it's called in theory. Positivism is that even in theory, those thinkers that science and I don't know, men are this way, women are this way, the way we used to see things in science were fixed. And if you think they are fixed, and you are part of the group who's not the winning one, it's kind of hard to have hope. So he worked a lot at helping people understand that, no, that's actually not true. Things are unfinished. The way we understand the world is shifting constantly. You know, and we can look at history, all of us. women and men rights, for example, it's shifted. It is. It's continuing to shift as well. It's not finished, it's unfinished. And by acknowledging that things are unfinished, what happens to my experience of life? So let's say I was part of a generation as a queer person that everyone around me, when I did my coming out, told me that I would be in a closet all my life. And that's the way I was in my teenage years. So I never spoke about it to anyone, things like that, right? But then I started seeing that things were shifting around. So my experience of being queer changed a lot at that point. I felt much happier because I felt there's hope. There's hope that I could do my coming out in a safe way, or I could still work as a social worker, or all these things. So we can see that the unfinishedness of life creates a possibility of hope. So, for example, in my groups, we would speak a lot about the history of homophobia or heteronormativity and stuff in our support groups, because I wanted the teenagers to look at how things had shifted. I didn't tell them that. We just look at history. Then, like, what does it mean for the future? Well, we could go there and do this and this and that. So they wanted to change the world. What happened about their home? They had hope. So that's a really important one. The other one is recognizing our own condition. You know, recognizing our own condition. That's really powerful, because once you start recognizing your own condition, you kind of just become the master of your own mind. You can shape your own experience of life. But it's the same thing with the folks. Right? Once they become more aware that there's conditioning, and it is invisible. It is invisible. You know, until you see it, you don't really believe it's there. So it's difficult. There's a change of consciousness that can happen. But that can be very, very powerful, because again, you can become the master of your mind. So another things he suggests in his pedagogy as social workers and educators is to have the conviction that change is possible. So we talked about unfinished now, which leads into having that conviction that change is possible. But also it's to accept to live with risk, because as we engage in political aspects, the first time I brought the teenagers and the young adults to speak in front of government for equality in the government building with the politicians, there was a risk. We didn't know. Actually, the group before us was an extreme right-wing religious group, and the group after us, and they were in the same space with us. So there are risks involved with getting involved. And ourselves as social workers, we have that as well. My personal advice on this is you have to choose when you do it. Be aware of, prepare yourself, and maybe have the right supports for afterwards. Same thing if you do it with folks. If you risk it to do something more political, think about it before and think about what supports would be useful afterwards. And give people choice if they want to do it. And also, well, let's go to the next one. This time it's going fast. Another one that we like a lot in social work, I think the empowerment perspective talks about it quite a lot. The question about the respect of the autonomy, I would say even the uniqueness of each person, the respect of the fabulousness of each person, but also the one of your own. Your own. And that's maybe something that we struggle as social workers, because we want to be everything sometimes. But you have to also respect who you are, what's your personality. Maybe you have your own pains for the past that you're carrying. You have to be mindful of those. And that's all right. We're a big gang of people in social work, so I don't have to do everything myself, right? Kind of a big, that's what you say in English, gang? It's a gang. I don't know what it means, but maybe it has different meanings. Yeah. The next one, you probably heard about this one. I think, yeah, the next one. Praxis. You probably heard about this at your classes. It's very trendy right now. It's been trendy since the 70s. And it's so essential to who we are as social workers, the connection between theory and practice, the exploration, how one helps the other. I don't know, there's so many ways of seeing this. I think all your profs want you to do this in all your assignments all the time. But what does it mean when I work with people? You know, what does it mean when I work with people? So for Freire, he was very clear about this. He said, well, that's my translation. Sorry for my English. Theory, reflection. Sorry, action without reflection. Action without thinking. It doesn't really work. It's kind of dumb, right? But thinking without action is kind of useless, right? It doesn't do anything. So it's creating that bridge between that thinking and action and that space. And maybe that's already revolutionary in these days, where we don't have those spaces to think about what we're doing. It can be embodied in different ways. At the individual level, we work with the group. Maybe if you have the chance and great opportunity of working with a collective, a collectivity or community, you can also embrace that in your practice. I try to sprinkle it everywhere. Socially, I try to sprinkle it everywhere. And then I have a wave once in a while. To catch a wave, go on it and serve. What I mean by that is at some point you'll feel your group, the people you're working with, have more energy to embrace that practice space because they're having those light in their eyes, or they're having those awakenings, those moments. So then you can do it a bit more. Be sensitive about people. Look for those lights once in a while. Please let me know if you have any questions at any point. We're almost there. And we'll have maybe a couple of minutes for questions at the end as well. So the next one, dialogue. This one is kind of self-explanatory. Anyways, it's an indispensable tool for us as social workers, but also as educators. I don't have much to say, but I put it there because I wanted you to have it for the workshop. Because maybe that's a spot where you did some important learning, when you were having a conversation with a senior colleague, or maybe you were mentoring someone and that's something. Dialogue is really important. Next, please. So I forgot to mention in the last slides we're going to how. How do we do critical pedagogy? So I was talking about dialogue, but now one of the main tools that Freire uses, what he called problem-posed pedagogy. I kind of like the word problem-posed pedagogy. So in a way, it's about finding the problem, but also about solving it. It's kind of about both. Sometimes we present students with a case study where the problem is already there. But this is kind of taking a step back and thinking about, posing the problem at the same time. So again, it's a whole idea of learning by solving real life problems. And Freire was kind of pulling his approach because he would ask people, what's happening in your life? So it's not about bringing a case study that will solve different problems with people, but asking them, what's happening in your life? Then we go from there. And then we do some problem solving and learn in that process by including at the same time dialogue and critical and praxis, critical thinking. Doing those tools we saw previously. That was often his approach. So in summary, the next one. So I tried to conceptualize, this is brand new stuff, maybe it works. I tried to conceptualize a visual of this theory of freedom, autonomy. And that's kind of a summary. So in some ways, he asks us to think about how to be prepared for learning, for motivation, what motivates us for learning. By being curious, joyful, hopeful, so that was the first slide. And then he asked us to have self-reflecting elements, like recognizing our conditioning, being aware of the unfinishedness. So that's the critical thinking part that we see in social work. But then also he asks us to build autonomy, ourselves and then with the people we work with. Recognizing and building my own freedom, autonomy, and power. But then he asks us to engage in praxis and dialogue. Because that's a really important way to raise our awareness, to do the learning. But also he thinks that learning happens in problem posed or learning in action, or I think we do social. But that's the way I try to see it as a cycle now. So there's that mental positioning, There's those big ideas around unfinishedness and conditioning. And then there's that self-realization that I can think on my own. I have that capacity. I have that power and autonomy. And then engaging in it, dialogue and composing. Any questions about the cycle? So I have some questions.
It might be like kind of interchangeable, but is there like a distinct difference between action and
No, those are kind of synonyms.
Okay.
I have a synonym this one. I think they're similar. Experiential is also a pedagogy. So very action is something. The way we used to say that social work is learn in action. Yeah. So I don't know if it's a very common question. All right. Sounds good. So these are your tools for the workshop, but I'm not finished. There's still a bit more. I still have 10 minutes left. So I really enjoyed this sentence when I found it because I was missing a piece. I was doing my research on the empowering perspective, and something didn't feel right to me because I didn't understand the sentence. I hadn't found it at that point. Maybe you know, when you read a book and you don't see it, and you see it the second time or the third time or the fifth time. Anyways, I found it there. He said to his friend Ronaldo, "I don't want to be imported or exported. It is impossible to export my practices without reinventing them. Please tell your fellow American educators not to import them. Ask them to recreate and rewrite my ideas." So he was giving me the card that was missing in my quest. He gave me permission to rewrite stuff. He said, "Not only I give you permission, you have to do it or it's not going to work." Okay, so for me, it was crucial because sometimes in social work, it doesn't fit the theory we look at, right? It doesn't fit. But that's why he gave us the card. He's giving us permission to see. Okay, then if it doesn't fit, that's okay. What fits for you? Think about it. And that would be your main question for the workshop later today. But I wanted to talk a bit about bell hooks because I wanted to give it a US touch because we are in the US today. And I discovered bell hooks actually recently. There is 2 academias in Canada, Francophone and Anglophone, and they don't communicate that way. So I haven't read much English authors until I reached Vancouver and work at BBC now. And last year I started reading bell hooks and I just couldn't stop. It's so amazing. But the thing I learned is she was a big fan of prayer as well. She was a big fan of prayer as well. And here's a few quotes she liked herself. And there was struggle as subjects in order to later become subjects. Okay, that's a good one. Think about it for a few years. Once you learn to look at yourself, that's the awakening, the political awakening we talk about in this talk that she's sharing here. That's the one I hope you get a chance also to experience in your unique way, your own personal way. I think all of us, we have experiences that social work changed. Right? Before I watched, what was it, movie yesterday, West Side Story, one people came. I watched it before being a social worker. I watched it yesterday. The experience was so different. So different. But this is kind of a unique thing to choose West Side Story before critical thinking. Workshop and stuff, right? Something quite unique, but interesting, right? Because we see things differently. This is the next one. And what I also enjoyed about Belle is she also had a critique about Ferry. And I just wanted us to hear her critique of Ferry and the question of masculinity in good writing. Press play, please. This one kind of self-explains. So it's only for vision.
Individual work through reading his books, and then when I was in graduate school, he came to the University of California, Santa Cruz, and I was at that time I just published my first book on women, Black women, and feminism, and people actually tried to keep me out of what was going to be a small group of 25 people meeting Paulo Freire because I didn't want feminist issues to intrude upon this man of this, great educator coming from another country. And someone said, this is just absurd. This is what education is all about. And they gave me their slot. And sure enough, I wanted to ask Paulo about all of those, comments about liberation being about men coming into their humanity and manhood. And when I did, people immediately tried to silence me. And he won my heart forever because he said, stop. What are you trying to do? You shouldn't. She's absolutely right to question. That's what I am saying in my work. And for that moment, he was such an incredible embodiment of who he was as a teacher and as a human being in the world, that he said, look, I'm writing about openness and interrogation and the fact that people should be able to ask questions, that that's what learning is about. So I don't want anybody keeping someone from asking me difficult questions about my work. And that was the beginning of my personal relationship with Paulo Freire, which continued. And over the years that we talked about the way I was trying to bring a feminist component to education for critical consciousness, because so many of the men that have been influenced by Paulo's thinking have not wanted to move it forward, even though he has championed the notion of moving in a more progressive direction around language.
Right, this is very interesting because very acknowledge that it has limitations. Yeah, we all live with conditioning, and this conditioning is not visible a lot. We uncover it like an onion. Sometimes because it has layers. We uncover it, but there's many blind spots we still have. So even Freire in his adulthood, he has a lot of blind spots, but he wasn't scared of being functional. He said, that's good. Thank you. I want to learn from your experience. And that's the mindset I think critical teachers should have, or we as social workers we should have as well, as we encounter other folks. Oh.
Oops, sorry.
I have to go back to the next slide after this.
Yes, I'll get
Yeah,
there
unfortunately,
in just a second. Oh no.
The way this last year, never got the chance to meet her in a formal talk one day. I would love to do that. She continues. Oh,
I'll be right back. I have to pull up your email again.
okay. Oh, we have time for one more. One or two more. Yeah.
Do you think that would comment and change what you're after?
I would read the points that year and the following books. I think there's a few things also. A lot of people who read from her translation. So I'm wondering if it's impact on gender as well. I don't know. You want to speak to Portuguese here?
I can talk a little bit about
so
that.
A binary language like French, where everything is feminine.
So it's not an excuse for Freire that he only talks about hombres, right? Because in the version, if you look both at Portuguese and Spanish interpretation of Portuguese,
Yeah.
it is exclusionary, the way that he writes. And other thinkers as well, like Orlando Falsborda, who is a huge inspiration for my work as well. I find the same thing. So
that's the old school of writing where.
And there are
the
ways,
French
right?
used to the masculine for all. That was the way it was. It changed. Well, most of us changed. That was a cultural inheritance of domination, masculine in writing. All right, and I want to show this little video if you don't mind.
Yes.
We have to change the scale of that.
She speaks about that wholeness in this one. Okay.
Just want to make sure.
Or that liberation that we talked about. Oh.
Sorry, I just want to make sure that we're screen sharing as well. Sent. All right.
In the last few years, we've got technology adaptation. So many results.
Yeah. Okay. It seems to be I'm like in the wrong view here. It's because it's in we have it online. That's the thing. But we'll just in the recording, we won't see the screen in this last part.
Migration. Because if we continue to judge ourselves by the standards set within that imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, then we never move. Because even if we move, but we still have what I call the voice of judgment. My theory is that the dominating culture depends on the voice of judgment. You know, that even when you're succeeding, you're not good enough. Even when, you know, I didn't think I was a writer, even after I had books published. Because, you know, for me, you know, what did I think a writer would be? What would be the magic moment that I could say, I'm a writer? And that whole thing had to do with my needing some type of validation outside myself to give me power, and not to be able to think of, you know, power that I can give myself, that we can self-generate. And I worry, and I talked a little bit, we're not going to talk about Black Lives Matter tonight, but I was saying, sometimes I worry because so many of our energies of protest and resistance are outer directed. You know, last night I asked audience, what if we took away all the police brutality in our society against Black males? Would Black males be self-actualized? Is it really police brutality that is keeping Black males from, you know, I mean, I mentioned my brother last night. My father used to say, blow, your brother ain't working. And he loved putting my brother down. I mean, it's amazing that my brother could come out of addiction. You know, when I hear people like putting little Black children and boys, especially stupid, you go down, you think, how will that person empower themselves from that? How are we healing from that? This particular conversation has to do with moving from pain to power. And that's really what we want to discuss about how do we, as people from oppressed and exploited groups, find our way to joy, find our way to emotional well-being, to healing.
So let's read her first sentence there. I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw in theory then a location for peace. The whole idea of becoming oneself, and maybe education in case of books can be a space for that. Or maybe our space as a social worker, where we meet with people and help them become more whole, but also by including that political side. So including that political side. Thank you. The next one, I'll go quickly. I wanted to bring just a few concepts from that book. The next one. That's okay.
We have to change the scale.
So these three ideas, the last one is love and I thought were good highlights for us in the things that help us learn from critical pedagogy. And the last thing she talks about quite a lot of the books that I really enjoy, which is very taboo sometimes in social work, is the emotion of love. The emotion of love and how we can use that emotion of love in our states, as in our own experience as well as social workers, but that space where we need to focus as well. And of course, the importance of community, creating learning spaces or social work spaces in our kids. Okay, so what I suggest we do because of time is the next one I'll present them at the beginning of the workshop.
Okay.
So we can go to the last slide. I've left at the end of the slides references, but you know, I just wanted to say at the end of this talk, I'm so happy I'm here and I've done this, and I hope I made my grandmother proud. She knew I was a social worker, but every time she spoke to me before I started teaching, she always asked me how my students were. But she thought I was a teacher, or I think she perceived me that way. She was encouraging me to do teaching one day. So yeah, so thanks everyone for giving me the opportunity of doing this today. I was very, very, very happy to do this. So thank you. To respect time, if you have a question, do we take minutes now or later after lunch?
I think it would be great. Well, if folks are okay, just maybe five minutes for one. Let's take one pressing question, and then we can continue into lunch, perhaps.
Okay. And really, it's going to be questions. It's more discussion space. Coherent for you to say. You have to ask me questions for any fun. Right? If there's any comments, thoughts, ideas, yes. Yeah, I mean, it's a good topic. I think your question is also the answer. I think the main thing we forget, we're so busy as social workers that we don't get involved politically so much. And I get it. You know, I've been in the field for quite a long time and I get really, really busy. But we know what happens if we don't create that space. So us as professionals, we also need to create that space. It's not only about the people we work with, right? We also need to create that space to be involved politically and make sure that our profession is strong and healthy, for example, and that we're influencing governments and their decision-making and things like that. So I think opportunities like these are unique. They don't happen enough where we get to encounter other people. And I hope you all get to create connections so you can keep maybe conversations happening. Because I think that space is a little bit missing. I think we've all lived in neoliberal, very busy societies, industrial style of social work. And if you think about it, neoliberalism don't like us having time because time gives us the opportunity to reflect and think and take action.
Yes.
So social workers in downtown
Yes.
Vancouver used to have a caseload of 60 in the 90s. That's for case management. So folks who are staying at home. So because they had an injury or a disability and they need care, they need a lot of care. Now the social workers in downtown Vancouver has up to 130 cases to work. So what time do they have? So we need to think about these things.
So we
Thank you
have
for your
maybe
question.
one more question, and then we can walk in toward lunch.
But the last 2 days we are like following social work. I just want to establish pedagogy somehow social work. How far for us to have kind of that critical social work, given the conditions that
policy. So for me, I would like to first how we can transform or translate this critical paradigm how it's possible. Also, I feel like it's pretty important that make this work. Even the principles of liberalism, like individual, like how far we can transform this.
It's a good question. I may not be able to answer all of it, but I can tell you what my experience. I think yes, you can and you should do critical aspects in your social work practice, in everyone's. But the problem with these theories is we tend to see them as very big, and then they become non-applicable. But they can be applicable in small things, and that's where everyone should start. When I was working with a teenager in this her coming out process, for example, I was doing critical social work at that point. We were deconstructing internalized oppression by having a chit-chat discussion, but I knew what I was doing, right? I was helping the person reconstruct or deconstruct first internal perception and reconstruct. You know, we were planning. Anyway, so I think one of the problems with critical theories is we tend to see them as very, very big and forget what they can look like in a day-to-day life. You know, and they can look like many, many things. So it's hard to answer your question in that sense. But I was working in a hospital one day and I realized a lot of my patients didn't tick one box of the health system in DC. A lot of them, and I couldn't get one of my patients to get housing, for example. So I had a conversation with this person, and I said, you know, I tried these things, they didn't work. Do you think we could do something political together? And he said, yeah, I'll do it. I'll do it because I see so many friends suffering from the system. I'm going to go and do it because of that. And this person was heavily impacted by disability, had trouble talking, walking, thinking, and all these things because this person had a Huntington. And we went to the MLA, and this person took 20 minutes to say 3 sentences. But he did it himself, and I completed this, his work. And we influenced the government into changing some of their policies by that one week. Mm. And I was thinking, how does this person feel afterwards? How has this changed his perception of having a disease, for example, or disability? This person recovered a sense of power, autonomy. This person allowed himself to think critically again and politically. Because sometimes when we have a disability, we think we can't do that. So I included my critical thinking into one relationship, which had an impact on many of my patients afterwards. You know what I mean? So we can be creative on the way we include it in our day-to-day things. And also, of course, you can include it at a bigger level as well, like joining forces with other social workers of the organization, for example, and look at the structural aspects that haven't worked for you and try to advocate to change them and things like that. But very special because when he did this with people, he was sensitive at how it moved them and changed them. And I think that's what we need to also include in our practice. An awareness that it's moving consciousness, it's moving that feeling of feeling whole. It's actually a therapy, right? It's like a therapy or something. I'm not sure if I answered, but these were the thoughts that popped up in my mind. I feel like social work is also like very difficult for them. You're already doing what Ferry did. You did a critique of education. You're doing a critique of the system or something. So maybe start with that. Continue thinking about that system that's hurting us as social workers, because that will be the map of finding what will work as a solution afterwards. We need to understand the problem. I like that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, our lunch is waiting for us. Yep. And so thank you. Can we give a big round of applause to Professor Coulombe? Thank you so much. That was beautiful.
Okay, you survived, now you have lunch.